Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about India's international relations to help viewers understand the nuances and the in-depth knowledge, gain in-depth knowledge about India's foreign relations, India's involvement in shaping the emerging world order. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the theme of India's trilateral partnerships. India plus two other countries jointly teaming up for dialogue and for activities and projects on the ground to remake different regions of the world and also to advance their respective national interests. And to discuss this topic, I have a very distinguished guest with me in the studio. Let me introduce you to him, Professor Harsh V. Pant. Professor Harsh Pant is one of the leading scholars of international affairs in India. He is a professor at King's College London and Vice President of Studies and Foreign Policy at a top think tank, Observer Research Foundation. Harsh, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Hello, Sreeram. Well, good to be here.
Harsh, when we talk of trilateral partnership, trilateral cooperation, it's obviously different from bilateral, and it's not as big as multilateral as in broader, bigger groups. So, and it seems like India especially is engaging in more of these trilateral formats lately. So, why do you think this is happening, and how do you see trilateral as a distinct category, if at all it can be termed so, from the bilateral and the broader multilateral?
Sreeram, this is an age where multilateral institutions are not working, and everyone is disappointed and dejected almost by the state of disarray that we find in our multilateral frameworks. And trilateral cooperation takes us beyond just a bilateral interaction between two states and allows us to frame our respective national interest, respective functional cooperation in ways that perhaps would not be possible in a strictly bilateral format. Now, triangular cooperation, which used to be which has been the norm for quite some time, where you will have a relationship where three countries would come together and deliver aid or work on infrastructure in certain countries. Yeah. That had been the norm especially in the developmental aid areas. But what recently we have seen is a strategic cooperation has taken the focus as far as trilaterals are concerned, and that in some ways the world is trying to fill a void that is being left by the multilateral institutions. So when you don't have multilateral institutions working, it becomes easier for like-minded countries to come together, form ad hoc coalitions around certain functional areas. And that is, I think, what many countries are trying to do, including India, in the range of trilaterals that we have articulated in recent years. And I think it's likely that this is going to be the preferred mode of cooperation for some time now, given where we find ourselves in the inflection point in global order.
Yeah, so structurally, the weakness of multilateralism is propelling this trend. But Harsh, going back to the bilateral, I mean, obviously trilateral builds upon strong bilaterals among all the three players. So why not just leave it to bilateral? So why should we extend it or take it to the next level of bringing in a third player? I mean, let's take the India-France-UAE, for example. That's one of the major new initiatives India has taken in terms of trilaterals. Now, already India has got strong strategic partnerships with both France and with the UAE, right? So what is the need for bringing all three and pulling all three into one format rather than just sticking to the bilaterals that we have with each other?
Because I think the bilaterals in and of themselves would not give you the kind of leverage that you want in that particular geography or on certain functional issue areas. So as you point out, India has excellent relations with UAE and with France bilaterally. But those are then bilateral distinct relationships. If you want a regional impact of your foreign policy, then you need to bring these stakeholders together. And I think that's what perhaps India has done with France and UAE in this case, and with other partners in other geographies and other functional areas. So I think bilaterals and the way our solid bilateral relationship evolves takes us logically into the trilateral mode, because if you are dissatisfied with the multilateral institutions, and you don't have multilateral institutions, for example, at the moment, if you talk of Indo-Pacific, we don't, it's a new geography.
Grouping,
exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that particular geography? So in that sense, it's easier to build on the bilaterals. If you have strong bilateral relationships with partners, then you can bring them on board and say, let's try out and see whether we can work as a collective on certain areas. So I think that perhaps is the logic of taking forward the trilateral engagements, and the rapidity with which we have seen these trilaterals grow perhaps tells you that many countries find them very successful in the short term in bringing to bear their respective capacities. So if you have, for example, India, UAE have certain kinds of capabilities, certain kinds of interactions, and India, France, another kind, then bringing them together perhaps gives you greater leverage in shaping the regional security, economy, prosperity, and stability.
And one can also pool resources, and each country, each player in this trilateral format may bring their own respective comparative advantages to the table, which makes more possibilities. Viewers, India, France, UAE, we have just been talking about it with Professor Harsh Pant. I have a video statement for you from Shrabana Barua, who is at the Indian Council for World Affairs. And I'd like you to hear her view on the India-France-UAE trilateral and the diplomatic energies that we are investing in this, and then continue the discussion after hearing from Shrabana Barua.
India, France, UAE have been engaging in a trilateral format since last year. For the first time, it met in July, for the second time on the sidelines of the 77th UN General Assembly when it was elevated to the ministerial level, and for the third time on 4th February recently. There have been many areas of cooperation identified, starting with the Indo-Pacific, where engaging with forums such as IRA have also been kept on the agenda. There are also areas such as energy, where solar and nuclear has found focus, given that in the past India and France have cooperated over the International Solar Alliance. The UAE has led Mangrove Alliance for Climate. These areas of convergences are seen as timely, therefore. Also timely is the fact that India is leading the G20 presidency as well as that of the SCO this year, and the UAE is going to host the COP28. On climate issues, India has also its vision of Panchamrit, making it one of the only countries to have reached or almost reaching its target in the NDCs. Its concept of life has also been endorsed by the other two countries. Therefore, these areas of cooperation are not only seen as convergences but are also seen as action oriented. Another area of cooperation has been startup and technological innovation. In fact, a Startup 20 engagement group has been introduced under the Indian presidency. But it is also to be remembered that India has been engaging with other countries in such formats. The Australia, India, Indonesia is one example. Australia, India, France is another. Therefore, we have to see the trilateral cooperation between India, France, and UAE as also proactiveness of Indian diplomacy, its capability in taking multilateral action, and growing complexities in the Indo-Pacific.
So viewers, you just heard from a researcher at Indian Council for World Affairs about growing complexity in Indo-Pacific and India's proactiveness. And she thinks that that's why the trilateral partnerships are happening. Harsh, India, France, UAE, we've already spoken about the convergence, but she was also mentioning the ones that trilateral formats we have entered with Australia. And there is one with France involved in it, France, Australia, India, and it was in trouble for a while because of, not because of these three, but because of extraneous reasons with the US coming in and playing spoilsport on a submarine deal. But Australia is another major pillar with whom we are doing trilaterals. Australia, France, India, Australia, Indonesia, India. And likewise, we have with Japan as well. Japan, Australia, India again. There's the so-called Japan, America, India, and even Japan, Italy, India. We have formed dialogue trilateral. So, and all of these have the Indo-Pacific domain as their basis. And like you said, the more of a strategic element is visible in the way we are forming these groups. And some of these, of course, are intersecting. And some of these also feed into larger grouping like Quad, for example, which are 4 countries, not just 3. But all of them seem to have the bedrock, which is that we want to be proactive in terms of forming these small clubs or groups with specific purposes. We heard about all kinds of things ranging from climate change to maritime security to infrastructure. There are many initiatives these kind of trilaterals are engaging in. So what does it all add up to? I mean, when we say they are strategic, we would expect that they are generating some kind of public goods for the region, helping to do the rebalancing that we hope will happen in the Indo-Pacific, and ultimately probably providing some kind of a counterbalance to Chinese hegemony and domination of the region. So your thoughts on all these, combinations that we're doing with France, with Australia, with Japan as the other major pillar, but then bringing in other third players into the picture. And perhaps from the point of view of the third players, like let's say Indonesia or Italy, just to take two as an example, maybe it's more comfortable for them to be part of these kind of groupings rather than directly join Quad. Indonesia, for example, would be hesitant because of fear of backlash from China direct. So maybe trilaterals also give you some degree of comfort and cushioning and protection. Your thoughts on all these things?
Yes, I think if you look at these variable geometries that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific in particular, because I think there is a logic to the emergence, which is, as we were discussing, that look, this is a new strategic geography. All the institutions that we have in this geography, they were part of that older framework through which you used to look at this disjuncture between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Now that we have brought it together in terms of our strategic mapping, it is very important to have these institutions that can respond to those challenges, and there are none at the moment at that scale, at the multilateral scale. So I think India has been pretty active in shaping the regional strategic architecture by creating these trilaterals, and of course the Quad being the other one, and of course Quad on two sides of the Indo-Pacific, one on the Pacific, one in the Middle East. But I think India's role in terms of bringing like-minded countries together is a very important, I would say, innovation in our strategic thinking, and perhaps in also international institutional statecraft. Because institutions, the understanding that students of international relations have is that institutions reflect a particular convergence around issue areas, and therefore they become more formal over a period of time, generate their own standard operating procedures, etc. But what we are now witnessing is that a lot of these ad hoc coalitions are emerging. I would say ad hoc because there is, you have these many, as you were pointing out, a number of these trilaterals and a few quadrilaterals emerging across this vast geography. So how do you respond, when you look at the strategic flux in the region? You respond by creating some kind of an institutional architecture, and perhaps these are the building blocks of that, eventually what will emerge from this flux. And I think China's rise is particularly important because we are trying to respond to it much like other countries are, and because they don't have any other avenue, they are much more, as you point out, much more comfortable in this trilateral setting where you can come together, join hands on certain functional areas. You are not defining the remit very broadly. You are saying we are going to work on certain areas, as I think was pointed out in the case of UAE and France. We are saying we will work on energy, we will work on climate change, we will work on sustainability. But of course, there is a comfort because all three countries strategically look as Western Indian Ocean as their primary geographic domain. So they are comfortable in operating in that space. So therefore, that brings them together to work on broader, sort of more environmental, sustainable development related issues. Similarly, when you talk of Japan and Australia, I mean, bilaterally, India is perhaps most comfortable at the moment with Japan and Australia in the wider Indo-Pacific. Now, how do you enhance the ability of these bilaterals to shape the strategic logic in the Indo-Pacific? You do that by bringing in more countries. Now, the easiest way to do that is by trilateral partnerships, which, as you point out, in almost all of them, either Japan or Australia is our preferred partner, and then we are bringing in other partners to add value to that relationship. So I think a number of very interesting innovations are happening, but I would look at it as perhaps India and some other nations' response to this institutional void that exists in the Indo-Pacific. What do you do if your multilateral frameworks are not working or are not up to the challenge of 21st century problems?
So we are filling the vacuum in a way. Harsh, also, is it observable that, leave aside the JAI, which in any way has been subsumed by the Quad now, Japan, America, India, but otherwise, almost all the participants in these trilaterals are middle to rising middle powers. So there's something peculiar about middle powers, isn't it, where we have strength in numbers and we have to come together and coordinate because multilateral or plurilateral or minilateral is the way for middle powers to exert influence, isn't it? And it looks like a lot of these are middle power coalitions or clubs. And is that also, you think, something to do with the international system? Because we are aspiring, India is aspiring to become a great power or leading power, as we call it. We have, on the way, but miles to go. So in the meantime, if we have to shore up the region, and if we have to maintain sea lanes of communication and rules-based order and all these, perhaps there is no alternative for middle powers than to come into these small groupings.
Yeah, I think that has been one of the most fascinating developments in the last few years, that middle powers shouldering greater responsibility for the provision of public goods. And I think partly I see this as a response to the structural dynamic of China's rise, but partly it is also the fact that I think many of these countries are uncomfortable with or unsure of where America is going. So, a lot of, Japan and Australia have long relied on their alliance with the US, and they still do. But I think there is some sense of vulnerability that they fear.
And so they want an endogenous within the region, yeah.
It seems that, and that's why you see, Japan under Abe was one of the most proactive proponents of middle powers working together. He pushed India much more into Indo-Pacific and thinking more creatively about it. And India responded. Similarly, you have Australia now, post its disjuncture with China, looking at Indo-Pacific in a much greater detail, and its partnership with India with a greater strategic focus. And so I think middle powers now looking at Indo-Pacific, resident powers there looking at this region as their primary area, and also thinking about how do you manage the challenges in the absence of America's commitment, which may not be total. Because America either is distracted, or the domestic politics within America is such that you really cannot rely on the transitions happening there. So how do you ensure that you are on a surer footing? And one of the best ways to do it is to find middle powers with whom you are like-minded and converge on certain areas, and that's what perhaps we are witnessing at the moment.
Yeah, and Harsh, one of the things you notice also with the trilaterals, India is also doing some very unorthodox ones in the military domain, defense, for example. There is the SITMEX, they call it Singapore, India, Thailand. All three of them forming a kind of a defense trilateral and doing joint naval exercises and all that. And so it suggests that also if there is no way for us, for the Quad to be expanded or for more people to come in, but we will find other means through which to keep these countries engaged and involved in security for the region. So specifically on the defense side, people know there are all the other things we're doing on the civilian side, infrastructure and climate change and energy and those sort of. But on the defense side, how do you think trilaterals will go? I mean, we also have the Malabar, which is 4 countries, which is essentially the defense counterpart to Quad. But then there are also other formations we're doing and trying to bring in more players. It looks like our diplomacy, our strategy is to bring in more players. And the Europeans have also come in. And this is making it more interesting, this region. The one with Japan and Italy is interesting. Japan and Italy are now ramping up their own bilateral defense co-production and joint ventures. And they find India useful, and the Italians are saying that they will bring in their prowess with regard to Operation Atalanta, which they had done to counter piracy in the Western Indian Ocean. And likewise, so there is this, defense side. And how do you think, how far can this go? And do you think this is enough joint exercises, or we should be doing more through these trilaterals?
I think on the defense side, we are still, maturing in some ways. We are still trying to assess how far we can go with some of these partnerships. But it is very important because I think one of the biggest issues in the region is perhaps, how do you make provision for regional security in a collective manner? And if you see the kind of challenges that China is posing everywhere, and if you see the enormous imbalance in the region, defense imbalance, given where China is qualitatively, quantitatively, countries that want to protect their sovereignty, countries that want to protect their autonomy, strategic autonomy, will have to do much more on defense, because at the end of the day, India as an emerging power will have to give that sense to smaller countries in the region, to smaller partners in the region, that it is their of course, as an economic partner, but also as a security guarantor of some kind.
Yeah.
We may not be able to do everything on our own. Therefore, we need partners that can work together. And India has, I think, Indian Navy has been very, very proactive for a very long time, for almost 2 decades now, in reaching out to littoral countries in the Indian Ocean, and in fact in the ASEAN groups that you talked about.
Yeah.
A lot of the countries do regular exercises with us, and I think that has evolved to a point where you can expand into trilateral engagements or even bigger engagements of that kind, which I think gradually we are moving in that direction. So I think defense is going to become an increasingly important component of the trilateral arrangements that we find ourselves pushing, but it will be almost inevitable that happens because of the security landscape and how that is changing, particularly in light of what may happen or what happened last year in Taiwan, and how suddenly the instrumentality of force is becoming such a visible issue in global politics.
Absolutely. Unilateral exercise of power is a major threat perceived by many of these middle and rising powers, and that's why they're coming together in trilaterals and other formats. Viewers, we also have traditional trilateral cooperation initiatives with the countries that are not necessarily only geostrategic, and these cover a variety of issue areas. And on this, I'd like you to hear India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar talking about how India forms a variety of partnerships based on the issues. Let's hear him and then come back.
The statecraft here is really how do you manage contradictions? How do you have different agendas, different partners, different abilities to deal with them? And that is actually the challenge for diplomacy. Now, it is also a particular challenge for bigger countries, because bigger countries have more varied interests. So when you have more varied interests, you have different kinds of partners. Now, if you look today at who are our partners, our political partners, our security partners, our developmental partners, our energy partners, our digital partners would all be different combinations of people. So it's not just how do you deal with 2 sets of people. Depending on the issue, you will get a different combination of countries to deal with.
Viewers, you just heard this from our External Affairs Minister saying that we deal with different combinations of countries depending on the issues. Harsh, there is the older South-South cooperation-based, trilateral formats which have existed for a few decades now. For example, we have the India, Brazil, South Africa, IBSA. We have the RIC, Russia, India, China. Now, these trilaterals predate the Indo-Pacific ones that we have just spoken, and in many ways they were formed in maybe the halcyon era of the South-South cooperation, when China was seen also as a middle power, and we all had something in common. We wanted to make the world better and revise the international order in a fair and just way. And of course, some of those concerns remain. We still, on climate change, on trade and such things, we have a lot in common with fellow developing countries. So if you look at those older ones, IBSA, RIC, those kind of trilateral, I mean, we still have ministerial meetings and so on, although we haven't had summits on this format lately. So how would you rate these in the current era, I mean, where there's more geopolitical competition? Would you say that these have lost their relevance, RIC and IBSA, and we should just forget them and just focus on the ones which have more strategic content? Or do you think that those will persist and those have their own momentum that will have to continue, given that we have these what Dr. Jaishankar calls varied interests on a range of topics as we become a bigger power?
See, I think institutions of any kind, they don't disappear that easily. So they'll persist, in some way. But the issue that I find is interesting and important is that the present ones, the newer ones that we have been talking about over the last few minutes, they have a strategic logic which is very sharp and very visible. The older ones like IBSA or RIC had some broader logic, as you were mentioning, the argument that, look, we are all developing countries, we all need to work towards multilateral reforms. All of those issues are very much alive, but I think the context has changed. So where China used to be a partner in terms of asking for multilateral reforms in a way that does not destabilize the entire system, today China has a very different agenda. Similarly, when you look at Russia, for example, it's still a bilateral partner for India. But on certain issues like territorial sovereignty and integrity, there are questions around whether we will be a partner in that context. So though the issues remain, which these platforms had highlighted. But I think that going forward, particularly with respect to China, it's very difficult to see how, given our present state of bilateral relationships, we can move forward, because the newer ones, as we were discussing, have a very strong bilateral component, that when you are bilaterally comfortable with each other strategically, you can then develop those trilaterals in a much more robust manner. Here the problem is, particularly with RIC, is China, and how our bilateral relationship with China is almost at a standstill. So what is the future? IPSA, I think, still is perhaps a very important one for India, given that both Brazil and South Africa, in different geographies, as fellow democracies, are very important part of a very bigger conversation, of a larger conversation that we want to have with the developing countries. And of course, India, that wants to project the voice of the global South through G20, would find that Brazil and South Africa will be very important partners in that journey, because they have very similar developmental strategic agendas broadly. But I think on RIC, you would find that you'll have to think more creatively as to what is the future here. Of course, it then also morphed into BRICS, which is a much bigger platform.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes RIC helps to moderate the Chinese, I suppose, through the Russian, intermediation and such things. But overall, viewers, you just heard from Professor Harshpant about these two different types of trilaterals, and what he's saying is that if there's more competition internally within the trilaterals, then they probably will not have the same kind of strength to be able to achieve the shared objectives. But overall, the point is trilaterals seem to be the trend in diplomacy, in Indian diplomacy, and also for many other countries. I want to thank Professor Harshpant for sharing very valuable insights on this emerging trend. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So that's all. This time, viewers, do think about trilaterals. Trilateral cooperation, trilateral partnerships are emerging as important combinations through which India is trying to advance its national interests, and also bring together like-minded countries to remake regional and international orders. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.